special guest lecturer, Ustad Abdul Hayy Darr, who's a prolific author who's traveled extensively in Afghanistan and done humanitarian work, and also a translator of both Mevlana Rumi and Mahmoud Shabastari, and we'll speak a little bit about that. We have questions for him, and I'd like to encourage everyone to also think about what questions you might have related to Sufism, Afghanistan, and Persian Sufi poetry, which is actually our topic for today in this class. It's perfect timing, thank you. And before we begin, there's other events I'd like to announce. Our speaker will be having an exhibition at the ICCNC, the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, which is in Oakland from November 24th until January 1st. And I'll send out an announcement so that everyone's aware. It's photographs of some of the people and children that Ustad Darr has met in Afghanistan and in the refugee camps. So I encourage everyone to go to the opening. It will count if you've missed our current event report. It will count for that, or for another assignment. We can speak about that later. And then it goes through January 1st. So thank you again.
You're very welcome. Pleasure to be here. Assalamu alaikum.
So we have some questions. Can you describe, to begin with, some of the living representatives of Sufism you met with in Afghanistan, and how you were drawn to study with them?
Okay. Well, I didn't get to Afghanistan until 1986, spring of 1986. My earlier life was spent raising a family, and so when my friends went to Afghanistan after high school, I was instead working, thinking about all these wonderful places they had gone to and listening to all of the stories. But I was already studying translations. And I first encountered Gulshan-e-Raz when I was 17, 45 years ago. And the Johnson Pasha translation had been made in the late 19th century. And I had read it several times. And it was reading that work and reading the translations of Rumi that were made by Nicholson and Arbery and translators of that caliber that made me think that there was something very special about this culture, the culture of the East and the culture of Islam. I, of course, am a Westerner, but I was raised in French Polynesia. It was a very different sort of environment. And when I moved to the United States at the age of 13, I found American culture, to be honest, maybe a little bit bland at the time. And so as I looked for things to read and to study, I was drawn to the Mahabharata, I was drawn to Buddhist literature, I was drawn to the esoteric traditions of Christianity, since I was baptized Catholic. And I was at a Catholic high school where I met Trappist monks and was interested in their search and their orientation towards spiritual life. So I have to admit that when I went to Afghanistan, it wasn't entirely for the sake of being an aid worker. It really was for the sake of trying to find out more about this, the profound teachings that I saw in the translations initially of Rumi, Hafez. I first started reading Persian through the quatrains of Umar Khayyam, because in the West we have known about his work for quite a long time, and everyone here is aware of the is probably aware of the Rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam, so much so that when you say Rubaiyat, people think that the only person who's written a Rubaiyat is Umar Khayyam. But he's something of an existentialist, or he appears on the surface to be a profoundly spiritual existentialist, a skeptic. He was a scientist, and of course he had developed a calendar more precise than, or as precise as the Gregorian calendar at quite an early period of time, 1,000 years ago or so. So these are all the reasons that I was drawn to this culture. And I was raised with 3 languages as a child, English, French, and Polynesian. And so I think that like the people of Central Asia, who are often raised with more than one language, the mind is more flexible for learning languages if we start out learning more than one language. And so I found Persian to be, I thought it should become the language of the United Nations, because I thought it was such a logical language, it was such a simple and straightforward language with sort of a perfect grammar compared to the European languages. And so I fell in love with the language right away. And I was studying with a Marxist Iranian refugee who had fled to India or someplace, and he was in San Francisco. And I told the refugee office there that I would help anybody who speaks Persian get resettled. So they hooked me up with this Marxist fellow, and I would be showing him around and trying to find an apartment for him. And he spoke very little English, and I spoke very, very little Persian, just from a book and from tapes and this kind of thing. But I started to learn Persian from him, and he was absolutely shocked that what I wanted to do was sit with him, and I would open Umar Khayyam to my favorite poems that I knew in English, and I wanted him to teach them to me in Persian. And so from there, the connection to Afghanistan is that for some reason, I then decided that I would stick with the quatrain form. And I got hold of the quatrains of Ustad Abdul Hayy, the Afghan poet laureate, Ustad Hayy, and I studied his poems in Persian with tutors, and then I thought about them a lot. Let me say that I'm a carpenter. I have no background in academics. I went to high school, and then I'm a carpenter. I'm a boat builder. But there was a poet, Mark Lindenthal, who used to come and sit at my boat shop in Marshall, which was forbidden that people would come and sit there. They could come at lunchtime, it was all. But he said to me, if I say nothing, can I sit in the corner of your boat shop? Because it helps me to think creatively. And I said, all right. But if you say anything, then you'll have to leave. But he never said anything, so he was able to stay. So when I did a rough translation of the poetry of Ustad Hayy, the quatrains, in 1989, actually I was translating the poetry as early as 1986, or 85 even, but they were published in 1989. Some of you may have seen the translation. I thought, you know, I'm going to call my friend Mark Lindenthal, who's now retired. He was a main professor of literature and poetry at USF, for those of you who may have heard of him. He's very famous in the Bay Area. I don't know if he's still alive. But he said that it was a strange story, but he would be happy to help me. So I went to him with my translations, and he said, let's start all over again with your translation. Let's start all over again. Let's forget about rhyme. And he said, I want you to just tell me what he's saying. And I'm not going to write a poem for you, but I want you to tell me verbatim what he means. And so that's what we did. And so I learned how to translate by having been raised with tutors on sailing ships, reading all of the English literature and a lot of French literature. And then I learned from Professor Linenthal, when he was retired, how to think about translation. And that's how I produced the first work in 1989, which was a translation of Ustad Khalili's poetry. Now, Ustad Khalili, he had an interesting reputation because some people, they didn't, most people did not believe, including some members of his own family, as it turns out, didn't believe that he had an experiential knowledge of Sufism. But those of you who have read my accounts of meeting him, I can only say to you that I haven't written everything I know about him. I've written what I thought was allowable to write about him. And he was a very profound person, extremely profound, and very spiritual person. And he belonged to a tradition. I introduced him first because, for me, he represents the kind of spiritual teacher that, in fact, I was looking for. And what we'll call them is the solitary ones. And it's a tradition in Sufism